April 1945. In the outskirts of a shattered German town, the war has already moved on. The guns are distant now, fading east. What remains is silence, broken by wind moving through collapsed roofs, and by the sound of children inside ruined buildings with no walls left to shelter them. They are not soldiers. They carry no flags. Many no longer remember when they last saw their parents. Rail lines are twisted. Civil offices are gone. Schools are ash. Across Germany, Austria, and soon Japan, millions of civilians are displaced, and among them are hundreds of thousands of children with no recorded identity, no home, no system left to claim them. American units enter these spaces cautiously. Their orders were written for combat, not for what they now see. Children sleeping in cellars. Infants passed between strangers. Older boys guarding younger ones through the night. Within days, something unfamiliar begins to appear behind the front lines. Fenced areas without guards. Buildings marked not for command, but for care. Food lines organized by age, not rank. These are not prisons. They are not camps. They are the first American-created safe shelters for enemy orphans, and they emerge from a war that was never meant to leave survivors this young. By the spring of 1945, the Second World War had entered its final and most destructive phase in Europe. German cities lay in ruins after years of strategic bombing. Industrial centers like Essen, Cologne, and Hamburg had been reduced block by block. Transportation networks had collapsed. Food distribution systems no longer functioned. Civil administration, once tightly controlled by the Nazi state, had disintegrated under the pressure of military defeat. The human cost of this collapse was not evenly distributed. Adults were dead, missing, imprisoned, or still moving with retreating units. Children were left behind in cellars, hospitals, evacuation zones, and burned-out neighborhoods. Some had been separated during mass evacuations. Others had lost parents to air raids, conscription, disease, or the chaotic final battles fought inside German towns. By early 1945, Allied intelligence reports began to register a problem not initially planned for in operational orders. Civilian displacement was reaching levels unseen in modern European warfare. Refugees moved west and south in uncontrolled flows. Among them were children traveling alone, unregistered, malnourished, and often unidentified. American forces advancing through France and into Germany were trained to defeat enemy units, secure territory, and maintain order. Their manuals addressed prisoners of war and hostile civilians, not large populations of orphan children. Yet frontline units increasingly encountered schools turned into makeshift dormitories, hospitals overcrowded with unaccompanied minors, and railway stations where children waited days for trains that no longer came. The scale of destruction was a direct consequence of how the war had been fought. Total war doctrine had erased distinctions between front and rear. Urban centers were strategic targets. Civilian housing stood beside factories, rail yards, and fuel depots. When those targets were destroyed, entire neighborhoods disappeared with them. In Germany alone, post-war studies would later estimate that more than 1 million children had lost one or both parents by 1945. In Eastern Europe, the numbers were even higher due to occupation policies, forced labor, and mass violence. Japan, still fighting in the Pacific, would soon face a similar crisis as American bombing intensified in 1945. At this moment, American forces were not yet an occupying authority in the modern sense. They were advancing armies operating under battlefield conditions. Supplies were prioritized for combat units. Medical services were stretched. Military government detachments existed, but their role was secondary to combat operations. Yet the presence of children without guardians forced a reconsideration. Leaving them unattended risked disease outbreaks, starvation, and long-term instability. Military commanders understood that chaos behind the lines could undermine security as surely as armed resistance. The situation was not ideological. It was practical. Orphan children moved unpredictably. They congregated around supply points. They followed units for food. In some towns, they were already forming informal groups for survival. American civil affairs officers began to report these conditions upward. Their language was measured. They did not describe sentiment. They described risk, numbers, and urgency. Behind their reports was a growing recognition that victory would mean little if the aftermath produced a generation raised in collapse. The war was nearing its end, but the consequences of how it had been fought were only beginning to reveal themselves, and they demanded responses that combat doctrine alone could not provide. By late 1944, Allied leadership had already begun to anticipate the administrative vacuum that would follow military victory, even if its human dimensions were not yet fully understood. Planning staffs in Washington and London recognized that defeating Axis armies would leave behind shattered societies, without police, welfare systems, or functioning governments. What they had not fully anticipated was the speed and scale at which civilian collapse would intersect directly with advancing combat units. To address this, the Allies had established civil affairs and military government units. These were small, specialized teams attached to field armies, tasked with restoring basic order once territory was secured. Their responsibilities included food distribution, public health, and coordination with local officials where any still existed. Initially, their focus was infrastructure and security, not long-term humanitarian care. Parallel to these military preparations, the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration (UNRRA) had been created in November 1943. Its mandate was to provide aid to liberated populations, including displaced persons, once combat zones stabilized. However, UNRRA was not designed to operate at the front. It required secure territory, supply access, and coordination with military authorities. In early 1945, those conditions did not yet exist across much of Europe. As American forces crossed the Rhine and moved deeper into Germany, civil affairs officers began encountering conditions that fell between combat and relief. Children were neither enemy combatants nor conventional displaced persons. Many had no documentation. Birth records had been destroyed. Local officials who might have verified identities were missing, dead, or compromised by association with the Nazi regime. In response, American military governments began issuing provisional directives. These were not grand humanitarian proclamations. They were practical orders. Vacant buildings, schools, monasteries, hospitals, undamaged barracks were to be requisitioned. Food allocations were to be adjusted. Medical officers were instructed to treat civilian children regardless of nationality or affiliation. The concept of the safe shelter emerged from these improvisations. It was not a single policy but a pattern. Areas were designated where children could be housed, fed, and medically examined under supervision. Unlike prisoner camps, these spaces were not guarded for containment. Their purpose was stabilization, preventing children from disappearing into the chaos of the post-war landscape. In Western Germany, U.S. Army Military Government, OMGUS, units coordinated with surviving local welfare workers to identify unaccompanied minors. In Austria and northern Italy, similar efforts followed the advance of Allied armies. In some cases, American medics encountered children living inside bombed hospitals long after staff had fled. In others, children were found living in underground shelters weeks after fighting had passed. These actions were not universally welcomed or immediately trusted. Axis civilians had been conditioned to expect punishment from occupying forces. Propaganda had long portrayed Allied soldiers as brutal and vengeful. For children who had grown up under those narratives, the appearance of American-run shelters produced confusion rather than relief. Yet the shelters continued to expand. They were documented, supplied, and inspected. Reports moved upward through command channels, and patterns became visible. Where shelters were established, disease rates dropped. Food theft decreased. Children stopped following military convoys in search of scraps. By the time Germany formally surrendered in May 1945, the groundwork for a larger humanitarian system was already in place. When UNRRA teams began operating later that year, they found structures that had been created not by relief agencies, but by frontline armies adapting to conditions they had never been trained to face. The war had ended on paper, but on the ground, its youngest survivors were still exposed to its consequences. And the American response, improvised, documented, and expanding, would soon become a defining feature of the occupation itself. From this foundation, the story widens. To understand what these shelters meant, It is necessary to examine the event from multiple perspectives: human, military, moral, and institutional. From a human perspective, the condition of Axis orphans in 1945 was defined less by nationality than by deprivation. Children arriving at American-administered shelters often showed the same patterns, whether they came from the Ruhr, Bavaria, Austria, or later from Japanese cities. Malnutrition was widespread. Many suffered from untreated infections, lice infestations, and respiratory illnesses caused by prolonged exposure in ruins and underground shelters. Psychological withdrawal was common. Older children spoke rarely. Younger ones clung to anyone who showed consistency. American medical officers documented these conditions in clinical terms. Height and weight measurements showed severe deficiencies. Dental examinations revealed long-term malnutrition. These records, preserved in military health reports, formed some of the earliest systematic post-war studies of civilian child health in Europe. Yet, the human dimension extended beyond physical survival. Children arriving at shelters often carried no proof of identity. Names had been forgotten, changed, or lost. Some could not recall their birthplaces. Family separation during evacuations meant that siblings were frequently split across regions. American administrators quickly learned that stabilizing children required more than food and shelter. It required routine, regular meals, assigned sleeping spaces, medical checkups conducted on schedule. From the military angle, this presented an unexpected operational challenge. Combat units were not designed to manage civilian populations, especially children. Frontline commanders initially worried that shelters would divert manpower and supplies from ongoing operations. These concerns were practical, not ideological. Trucks, fuel, and food were all limited. Every allocation had consequences elsewhere. Civil affairs officers worked to bridge this gap. They framed shelters not as humanitarian projects, but as security measures. Unattended children were vulnerable to exploitation, disease, and movement across unsecured areas. Stabilized populations reduced disorder behind the lines. Reports emphasized that shelters prevented looting, reduced black market activity, and lowered the burden on combat units repeatedly encountering the same displaced groups. This argument gained traction. By late April 1945, several U.S. Army groups had issued standing instructions allowing local commanders to requisition buildings specifically for child care. These orders were narrow in scope, but they marked a shift. The presence of orphans was no longer treated as an anomaly. It was recognized as a structural consequence of modern warfare. Logistics formed the third critical angle. Feeding children was not simply a matter of surplus rations. Military rations were designed for adult soldiers engaged in high-energy activity. Medical officers warned that such food could worsen malnutrition in children. As a result, kitchens were reorganized. Ingredients were diluted, cooked differently, and supplemented with milk when available. Medical supplies posed similar challenges. Pediatric care required dosages and treatments not standard in field manuals. American doctors improvised, drawing on civilian training and consultation with local medical staff who had not fled. Where possible, surviving German and Austrian nurses were retained under supervision, their expertise necessary despite political vetting. Sanitation became a priority. Shelters were inspected regularly to prevent outbreaks of typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis. These inspections were documented in weekly reports, reinforcing the idea that child care was not incidental. It was being integrated into military governance. Across these angles, human vulnerability, military necessity, and logistical adaptation, a pattern emerged. The shelters were not acts of spontaneous charity. They were responses shaped by observation, reporting, and institutional learning. Each shelter represented an adjustment in how the American military understood its role in a collapsing society. Yet these perspectives only explain how the shelters functioned. They do not fully explain how they were perceived, by the children themselves, by Axis civilians, or by those who had expected occupation to bring punishment rather than protection. Those perceptions would form the next layer of the story. From a moral perspective, the creation of safe shelters for Axis orphans forced American authorities to confront a question that had no clear precedent in modern warfare. How should a victorious army treat the most vulnerable civilians of a defeated enemy? International law offered limited guidance. The Geneva Conventions addressed prisoners of war and occupied populations, but they did not provide detailed frameworks for large-scale orphan care under military authority. In practice, decisions were made incrementally. American military government emphasized the distinction between responsibility and blame. Children were not considered participants in the war, nor were they held accountable for the actions of the regimes under which they had lived. This distinction appeared repeatedly in internal memoranda, which stressed that humane treatment of children was consistent with long-term stability and occupation policy. The enemy perception angle revealed how unexpected these actions were. Axis civilian populations, particularly in Germany, had been conditioned by years of propaganda to fear Allied occupation. Children, especially those raised in wartime youth organizations, had absorbed narratives portraying Americans as violent, racially hostile, and indifferent to suffering. When American forces established shelters rather than punitive camps, the reaction was often confusion rather than gratitude. Reports from civil affairs units noted that children initially resisted entering shelters. Some fled when approached by soldiers. Others refused food, suspecting it was conditional. Over time, patterns changed. Consistency mattered. Shelters that maintained predictable routines saw reduced anxiety. Children began to remain voluntarily. Local civilians, often women who had survived the war, began approaching American administrators to ask whether missing children could be admitted. This gradual shift in perception extended beyond the children themselves. For Axis civilians observing occupation policy, the shelters undermined expectations of collective punishment. They demonstrated that American authority operated differently than wartime propaganda had claimed. This did not erase resentment or grief, but it altered the immediate psychological landscape of occupation. The institutional angle provides further clarity. The shelters were not isolated initiatives carried out by individual officers acting independently. They were increasingly absorbed into formal occupation structures. In Germany, the Office of Military Government, United States, OMGS, began issuing standardized procedures for child welfare by mid-1945. These included registration processes, health screenings, and coordination with emerging local welfare offices. In Japan, following the surrender in August 1945, similar principles were applied under the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP. American occupation authorities encountered massive civilian displacement in bombed cities such as Tokyo and Osaka. Thousands of children had lost parents during firebombing campaigns. Drawing on lessons from Europe, American administrators prioritized the rapid establishment of child shelters and feeding programs in urban areas. UNRRA's arrival expanded these efforts. Relief workers inherited facilities originally created by military government units. In reports from late 1945 and 1946, UNRRA officials acknowledged that many effective childcare structures already existed by the time civilian agencies assumed control. The transition was not seamless, but it was deliberate. Military oversight gradually gave way to international and local administration. Across these perspectives, moral decision-making, enemy perception, and institutional evolution, the shelters came to represent more than emergency responses. They became symbols of a broader shift in how victory was exercised. Power was no longer expressed solely through control and enforcement, but through administration and care. This shift did not erase the violence that had preceded it, nor did it undo the losses suffered by millions of families. But it marked a turning point in how the war's end was experienced by those who had no role in its making. The moment when these shelters moved from improvisation to policy, from reaction to deliberate action, formed the true turning point of the story. The turning point came not with a single order or announcement, but with a convergence of decisions made across multiple commands in the late spring and summer of 1945. As combat operations ended in Europe, American forces transitioned fully from advancing armies to occupying authorities. This shift fundamentally changed priorities. Security remained essential, but stability became the dominant concern, and children emerged as a central indicator of whether that stability could be achieved. In May 1945, following Germany's surrender, U.S. military government units began conducting systematic surveys of civilian conditions. These were not symbolic gestures. Teams recorded housing damage, food availability, public health risks, and population movement. For the first time, orphaned and unaccompanied children were counted not as isolated cases, but as a defined category requiring policy-level response. Commanders recognized that improvisation had reached its limit. Shelters established ad hoc during combat could no longer operate on goodwill and local initiative alone. They needed standardization, oversight, and resources. In response, military government directives expanded the authority of civil affairs units to requisition buildings specifically for child welfare. Schools, monasteries, and undamaged municipal facilities were converted into permanent shelters under American supervision. This moment marked a shift from reaction to intent. Child care became embedded within occupation governance. Medical officers were assigned to shelters on a rotating basis. Supply officers adjusted requisition plans to include civilian feeding requirements. Liaison teams were created to coordinate with emerging German welfare institutions, carefully vetted for political reliability. Documentation increased sharply. Shelter registries recorded names, estimated ages, health status, and known family connections. These records served multiple purposes. They allowed for family reunification when possible. They reduced duplication of aid. They also demonstrated accountability within the occupation system, proof that American forces were not acting arbitrarily, but administratively. The psychological impact of this shift was significant. For Axis civilians, particularly those living near shelters, American authority became associated not only with control but with order. Children were no longer seen wandering between ruins or following convoys. They were contained not behind barbed wire, but within structures that provided routine and protection. In parallel, similar developments unfolded in the Pacific. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, American occupation authorities confronted devastation on an even larger urban scale. Firebombing had destroyed vast sections of Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama. Civil institutions were overwhelmed. Thousands of children had lost parents in a matter of months. Drawing on European experience, American administrators under SCAP moved quickly. Temporary shelters were established in surviving public buildings. Feeding programs prioritized children. Medical screenings focused on malnutrition and disease. While cultural and logistical differences shaped implementation, the underlying approach remained consistent. Stabilize the youngest survivors first. This was not presented as charity. Occupation directives framed child welfare as essential to reconstruction. A society unable to protect its children could not recover. Reports sent to Washington emphasized long-term consequences, education gaps, public health risks, and social instability if orphan children were left unattended. By late 1945, the shelter system had expanded beyond immediate military control. UNRRA began assuming operational responsibility in many regions, using structures and procedures established by American forces. The transition was gradual and coordinated. Military oversight remained, but civilian relief agencies now carried daily operations. The turning point was complete. What had begun as scattered responses to individual encounters had become a documented, institutionalized system. American-created safe shelters were no longer temporary measures. They were pillars of post-war recovery, embedded within the broader framework of occupation policy. And as these systems expanded and matured, their consequences, intended and unintended, began to reshape the societies emerging from defeat. As the shelter system expanded through late 1945 and into 1946, its effects began to register beyond administrative reports. The presence of organized, functioning spaces dedicated to orphan children altered the daily rhythm of occupied societies. Streets once crowded with displaced civilians became more controlled. Public health indicators showed measurable improvement. Disease outbreaks declined in areas where shelters operated consistently. American military governments monitored these developments closely. Weekly situation reports tracked shelter capacity, health outcomes, and supply requirements. These documents reveal a shift in tone. Early reports described emergencies and shortages. Later ones focused on maintenance, staffing, and coordination, evidence that child welfare had moved from crisis management to sustained governance. The stabilization of children also had indirect security effects. Intelligence officers noted a reduction in petty theft and scavenging around supply depots. Children who had once followed military vehicles in search of food were now accounted for. This allowed American units to focus on broader occupation tasks, from disarmament to infrastructure repair. Psychologically, the shelters carried weight far beyond their walls. For many Axis civilians, especially in Germany and Japan, they represented the first tangible sign that occupation would not mean indiscriminate punishment. Observers noted that local attitudes softened not because of propaganda, but because of visible policy. Children were being protected, not exploited. This perception shift was carefully managed. American authorities avoided public spectacle. There were no grand announcements or celebratory displays. Shelters operated quietly, their presence normalized rather than emphasized. This restraint reflected a broader occupation strategy. Legitimacy would be built through consistent administration, not symbolic gestures. By early 1946, family reunification efforts intensified. Shelter registries were cross-referenced with Red Cross records and local archives. In some cases, parents long believed dead were located in displaced persons camps or returning from forced labor. Reunions were recorded administratively, without ceremony, but their cumulative effect reshaped post-war recovery. For children whose families could not be found, longer-term arrangements were developed. Some shelters transitioned into permanent orphanages under local control. Others served as temporary institutions until foster systems could be reestablished. American oversight gradually receded, but the frameworks remained. In Japan, similar processes unfolded under SCAP. Feeding programs for children expanded into school lunch initiatives. Health screenings conducted in shelters informed nationwide public health reforms. The focus on children influenced broader Reconstruction priorities, from education policy to housing design. The culmination of this turning point was not a dramatic event, but a statistical one. By mid-1946, reports indicated that the majority of identified unaccompanied children in American zones had been registered, sheltered, and medically assessed. This did not eliminate suffering, but it transformed it from chaos into a problem that could be addressed systematically. The shelters had achieved their immediate purpose. They had stabilized the youngest survivors of total war. But their deeper significance lay in what they revealed about power exercised without vengeance, and authority expressed through care. That significance would only become fully visible in the months and years that followed, as societies rebuilt and memories of occupation hardened into historical judgment. In the immediate aftermath of the shelter system's consolidation, its results became visible not through celebration, but through absence. The absence of children sleeping in ruins. The absence of unregistered minors drifting between towns. The absence of emergency conditions that had defined the final months of war. For occupation authorities, these absences signaled progress. American military governments compiled post-action assessments throughout late 1946, measuring outcomes in administrative terms. Shelter capacity figures stabilized. Mortality rates among sheltered children declined sharply compared to the immediate post-war months. Medical reports showed gradual improvement in nutrition levels, particularly where milk and supplemental feeding programs were sustained. These outcomes were attributed not to abundance, but to consistency. One of the most consequential developments was the normalization of civilian administration. As German and Japanese civil institutions were reconstituted under occupation oversight, child welfare became one of the first areas returned to local control. This was intentional. Protecting children was considered politically neutral and socially unifying. It allowed emerging administrations to function without reopening ideological conflicts tied to the war. In Germany, newly reformed welfare offices inherited shelter records compiled by American authorities. These documents formed the basis for long-term social services, including education placement and health monitoring. In Japan, Data gathered through shelter-based medical examinations influenced national public health planning under SCAP, contributing to broader reforms in nutrition and school health programs. The shelters also shaped how occupation policies were perceived internationally. Allied observers and relief organizations noted that American zones exhibited lower levels of post-war civilian instability compared to areas where such systems had been slower to emerge. This comparison was not absolute, but it reinforced the idea that early investment in child welfare reduced long-term disruption. At a strategic level, the shelter system informed evolving doctrines on military occupation. U.S. Army studies conducted in the late 1940s cited civilian stabilization, particularly among children, as a key factor in successful post-war governance. These lessons would later influence planning for future occupations and peacekeeping missions. For the children themselves, the aftermath was quieter and more personal. Some were reunited with surviving family members. Others transitioned into foster care or permanent institutions. Education resumed, often in the same buildings that had once served as shelters. The experience of being protected by former enemies was rarely articulated in public discourse, but it lingered in private memory. The shelters did not erase trauma. Loss remained. Absence remained. But the presence of structure altered trajectories. Children who might have been lost to disease, displacement, or exploitation instead entered systems capable of supporting recovery. As occupation gave way to sovereignty and relief agencies withdrew, the physical shelters faded from view. Buildings were repurposed. Records were archived. What remained was a pattern established in the final months of war, a demonstration that the end of violence required more than surrender documents. It required responsibility for those left behind. That responsibility, once assumed, reshaped not only post-war recovery, but the moral legacy of victory itself. By the late 1940s, the immediate structures created during occupation had largely dissolved into national systems, but their influence remained embedded in policy and memory. The American-created shelters, once emergency responses, became reference points in post-war evaluations of humanitarian governance. They were cited in military studies, relief agency reports, and international discussions on civilian protection in conflict zones. In Germany, the welfare systems rebuilt after occupation drew directly from shelter-based practices. Registration procedures, health screening protocols, and coordination between local and international agencies reflected frameworks first imposed under military authority. These systems contributed to the rapid reintegration of orphan children into education and vocational training, supporting broader economic recovery during the early years of Reconstruction. In Japan, occupation-era child welfare programs influenced the expansion of public health initiatives. Nutritional reforms, school lunch programs, and pediatric care standards introduced under SCAP persisted long after the end of Allied administration. While these reforms were shaped by many factors, the experience of managing widespread child displacement during occupation provided critical data and urgency. Internationally, the shelter system informed evolving humanitarian norms. UNRRA's operational experiences fed into the development of later United Nations agencies, including UNICEF. The idea that children required immediate, specialized protection in post-conflict environments gained institutional support partly because it had been tested under occupation conditions. The shelters also affected perceptions of American power. For populations emerging from defeat, authority expressed through administration rather than retaliation left a complex legacy. It did not erase memories of bombing, loss, or occupation, but it complicated narratives of victor and vanquished. Former enemies had exercised restraint in moments where vengeance might have been expected. Historians examining occupation policies have noted this duality. The same forces responsible for destructive bombing campaigns also organized care for the war's youngest victims. This contradiction became central to post-war debates about responsibility, morality, and the nature of modern warfare. For the children who passed through the shelters, long-term outcomes varied. Some carried physical and psychological scars for life. Others credited the stability of post-war care with allowing them to resume education and rebuild identities disrupted by conflict. Their experiences rarely entered official histories, but they surfaced in memoirs, oral histories, and social research decades later. By the time Cold War tensions reshaped global politics, the shelter system belonged to history. Its immediate purpose had been fulfilled, yet its implications endured. It demonstrated that military victory created obligations beyond security and control. It suggested that how a war ends matters as much as how it is fought. The shelters were not symbols of redemption. They were acknowledgments of consequence. They recognized that total war produced victims who could not be categorized as enemies or allies, and that protecting them was a responsibility, not a favor. From this understanding emerged a quieter legacy, one that shaped post-war recovery and influenced future humanitarian thinking. All that remained was to consider what this episode revealed about war itself, and about the choices made when violence finally stopped.